If you want to import a multi-layer sample into the DTXpro, you need to have all the samples available before you start. I've done another video to show you how you can use a VSTI for this, but for this video, I'll assume that you have the separate samples already. On this video, we will just create a simple multi-layer sample using 10 head samples, 10 rimshot samples, and 10 cross-stick samples. There are other videos if you want to make more complicated multi-layer samples with up to 120 individual samples inside each one per pad. The more samples you use, the more detailed and the more realistic the final results will be. But for this, we'll just keep it simple so you understand the principle. You need to make sure that all your samples are edited correctly. You need each sample to start right at the start of each file, and you want to remove any empty space at the end of each sample so you aren't wasting the module's sample time. This takes a bit of time, but it makes the final results much better. For this example, I'm going to load and build a snare drum. So let's assume that you have all your head samples in one folder, all your rimshot samples in another folder, and all your cross-stick samples in yet another folder. The module can make 10 dynamic samples, from quiet to loud, into one user voice in Yamaha speak. This means that if you load in a single user voice onto a pad zone, the module will choose the sample inside that user voice that is closest to the dynamic you have played and will play that sound. This makes it much more realistic than just having the same sample regardless of how hard you play. You need to rename the samples, so firstly the module knows where to put them, and secondly so you know what they are and where you can find them later when you are putting them together with the other articulations. Give the samples a name you will recognise and number them so the first sample, 01, is the quietest and the last one, 10, is the loudest. If you have all 10 samples in the same folder, you can easily rename them all in one go. It is important to name the samples 01 rather than just 1, as if you do not, the module may put your louder sample, 10, in the quietest position because it thinks it is number 1. So now you have your 10 head samples, put them on a pen drive. You are importing 10 specific samples to 10 specific locations. And even though it's done automatically, I would suggest using a clean pen drive with no other samples on it. You don't want to find a random sample of a doorbell or a ringtone in the middle of your nice new snare drum sample. Insert the pen drive with your 10 samples, correctly named and trimmed, into the module. Go to Menu, Job, User Voice, Import All. Then press F1, Import Type, until it says to one voice. Then turn the knob or use the buttons to select which user voice should be used for your samples. To make sure you don't replace anything that you are using, make sure that the screen says Empty Voice. Make a note of which user voice you are using so you can find it quickly later. Using this method will import all 10 samples to one user voice and automatically adjust the velocity range for each sample so they are evenly spread from quiet to loud. Press F3, Import, and the samples will be brought into the module. Let's check that the 10 samples have loaded correctly and that you've got the names correct. Go to a kit by pressing Exit until you get back to the main screen. Go to the snare pad and hit the head. Go to Menu, Kit Edit, Voice. Under Category, choose User at the far right end. Under Voice Number, choose the location of where you have just loaded your samples. Play the head of the pad from quiet to loud, and you should hear all your 10 samples in the user voice. So now you need to go back and, using exactly the same method as you just did for the head samples, repeat everything and load in your 10 rimshot samples and 10 cross-stick samples. When you have done that, you simply hit the rim of the pad and select the user voice with your rim shot samples in. And then hit the cross stick and select the user voice where your cross stick samples are. If you are happy with it, save the kit. You might notice that your lovely new sample voice feels a bit different from the internal voices, and with good reason. Unless you happen to record your new samples in exactly the same way as Yamaha recorded the internal samples, they will have a different velocity curve. Because of this, you might, but not always, need to change the velocity curve of the snare pad when using your new voice. Or you can change the curve internally. This method is a bit fiddly, but it's very flexible and very accurate. And when you find the settings which suit you, you can duplicate them in the future for all other samples you import. Go to Menu, Job, User Voice, Voice Edit, and select the first voice that you want to change the dynamics of. Press Bank, F1, and then Function, F2, and then press F2 until Low-High is highlighted. Now you can adjust the velocity range of each sample inside the user voice to suit you. You can nudge samples up and down until they feel right when you play from quiet to loud. The only two things to make certain of is that firstly, every velocity level from 1 to 127 has a sample assigned to it, so you don't have silent holes in the user voice, and secondly, make sure that only one sample is playing at a time, that there is no overlap. Otherwise, you'll have two sounds playing at some velocities, which will sound strange. When you have made your changes and are happy with the playing response, press Exit and all your changes will be saved.